Hello and welcome to another episode of Mormons, Mystics, and Muons. I'm Eldon. I'm here with Gabe and also Alex Criddle joining us today. So excited for the three of us to have a conversation. Alex has some really interesting credentials and is involved in, I think, kind of the cutting edge of a lot of Mormon thought and history. And so we want to jump into some of his background, understand where he's coming from, hear some of his ideas and some of his thoughts on the forefront of Mormon history and where these things are going, and discuss some other thoughts that we have. Gabe will jump in as he feels necessary, and I will as well. So without any further ado, Alex, why don't you spend a few minutes introducing yourself and explaining kind of what it is you're researching and where your work is taking you, and we'll go from there.
All right. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on again. So my research right now, especially, is surrounding psychedelics, but especially psychedelics and Mormonism. So I've done graduate work in philosophy, where my thesis was on the nature of healing and the psychedelic experience. I've worked as a researcher at ketamine clinics doing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy for a number of years. I've worked as a psychedelic integration guide. I've created curriculum for multiple psychedelic therapy programs, and I've written for many psychedelic outlets. So while my background is mainly in philosophy, especially philosophy of mind, my research is surrounding mostly psychedelics and the ontology of the beings we meet in psychedelics, the phenomenology of the experience, but particularly lately, my research is around psychedelics and Mormonism. We're starting a group actually at the Harvard Divinity School. We got approval last week.
Nice.
Yeah, so that'll
That's
be
exciting.
launching and announced soon. We'll be officially announcing it at Sunstone later this month. But we've got Harvard Divinity School backing research in psychedelics and Mormonism now, so that's pretty sweet.
What are some of the
awesome.
things that group will be focusing on?
The whole spectrum. We'll be doing historical analysis, philosophical analysis. Michael Ferguson, who's at Harvard Divinity School and Harvard Medical School, he's a neuroscientist, is going to be doing observational studies with contemporary Mormons and psychedelics and ex-Mormons, and he's all about understanding spirituality in the brain. So we'll be covering that. We'll be looking at early Mormon history and Joseph's usage, how it influenced theology, and we'll even be doing work like Cody Nakoni is on Fred M. Smith and his role in introducing psychedelics to Harvard in the first place in the 1920s.
So Michael Ferguson, a quick side note, I checked out some of his stuff. He's got that interesting TED Talk. I don't know have you guys ever seen it?
Yeah.
I think I may have sent you a message about it, but he was, they were analyzing like what the spirit actually is, and I think they put people in like an MRI machine or something.
Yeah.
But they were all the other interesting thing that they did was they took quotes and then they misattributed it to a Mormon leader or a non-Mormon leader.
That's right.
And then they asked people to rate how much they felt the spirit, and the same quote, depending on if it was attributed to somebody that was outside of Mormonism or that they would have a negative context about, versus being attributed to a Mormon, had a really significant impact on how they felt the spirit. So it's interesting TED Talk. We'll put in the show notes.
Yeah, Michael's doing excellent work. So
what's the range of people's beliefs? It seems like you've got all across the spectrum in that group from what I saw so far on the Sunstone kind of panel.
Yeah, so I mean, it's pretty far across the spectrum. I mean, I don't really want to give their public beliefs with it. They can do that themselves, but we are across the spectrum, and the other people we're collaborating with are all across the spectrum too.
Cool.
So yeah, we'll have stuff from every angle, hopefully.
That's exciting. Yeah, I think that now that the history of Mormonism is much broader than maybe the narrow version that was being mostly controlled or output by the Mormon Church. Now that's broadened, and we have a much better access to information and kind of the spectrum of where esoteric ideas fit into its origin and all of those,
Right.
bringing
Well,
much more color to those stories. That'll be exciting to see the research come out of there.
yeah. Well, and one of the things that I'm trying to hammer hard in getting us approval for and helping the people at the Harvard Divinity School and outside, really everybody understand is just how broad this research is. Like, sure, we're looking specifically at the usage of psychedelics within Mormonism, but Mormonism didn't exist in a vacuum. Joseph learned things from different people. So, one facet of our research is looking at Joseph Smith's connections to the Native Americans and how he might have learned how to use psychedelics from them. Same with the occult practices. We know he was familiar with a wide swath of occult traditions, had access to the books, and we know that traditions such as like Rosicrucianism and whatnot were using psychoactive substances in their rituals and to learn to see God and whatnot. And even further is it really has implications in my mind for the Second Great Awakening as a whole period. So we have this period in history where just hundreds and thousands of people are seeing visions, they're having these fits, these trances, ecstatic states, and nobody's attributed it to drugs at all. They've talked about, oh well, maybe, you know, medical conditions or the power of suggestion, or like Ann Taves in her book Fits, Trances, and Visions, looking at those, talks about like the different periods and how around Joseph Smith's time people were starting to understand them as like mental states through like animal magnetism and whatnot. But nobody, as far as I've found yet, has suggested that maybe these people were using psychedelics and having visions. And one such example of that is, the more I'm reading old medical textbooks around the time, things like Datura, which is a psychoactive nightshade, was extremely common in medical practices. It was being prescribed for rheumatism, which was very frequent. It was being prescribed for epilepsy. It was mixed in concoctions to help with old wounds and to heal certain humors within the body. And Datura isn't a short-acting substance. So if you give somebody Datura on a daily basis, or even, you know, the night before they go to a church meeting, they're still going to be under its influence for a considerable amount of time after. So, you know, for all we know, Saturday night they take their typical Datura medical treatment, and then they come to church on Sunday and still under the effects, and so they start having visions, or their inhibitions are lowered, and so they can really engage with what the speakers are saying, like in Walter Pank's Good Friday experiment. Like, people just don't know or understand that these things were way more common than we realize, and probably had a way bigger impact on religion and culture at the time than we've ever understood or thought about.
One thing I want to get your thought on this. One thing I struggle with is the focus being on psychedelics rather than on altered states of consciousness in general. And, you know, I thought of this analogy where, like, you know, this mystical experience of, divine union, transcending time and space. I mean, there's some pretty characteristic things that you don't have to check all the boxes, but like that's a location. But there's plenty of different places to get to that, or ways to get that location. The easiest one is psychedelics. So like, location is New York. Psychedelics are the airplane because most people get there. But, you know, there's people that walk there. There's people that take the bus, and people, you know, confuse the mode of transport with the destination. So they'll say, you know, I love seeing the Empire State Building, and so I can't wait till I get on a plane next. Or, but you realize, hey, you know, there's the destination, and then there's the the modality, and the modality doesn't always, same modality doesn't always lead to the same place, but you can get there through different ways. And so with
Right.
me, with my experience, being, in episode 6, we talked about that journal article examining spontaneous spiritual awakenings and Kundalini awakenings, where the author actually had a spontaneous spiritual awakening, which is, she woke up into an altered state.
Is that the Jeffrey Martin article?
No,
it's
okay. Yeah, it's really fascinating. So they studied a bunch of people, survey, and people that claimed spontaneous spiritual awakenings or Kundalini awakenings. They let them kind of determine, not, they had to not be involving psychedelics, and then they examined how they compared with other modalities, and they were they were more powerful than DMT and psilocybin. It had a lot of overlap. So, and my experience being through that, it's easy with psychedelics to focus on that so much, because it's so reliable. But I think that you miss a bit of the picture and realize, like, it doesn't have to be that. And there are plenty of people that have these things without it. And there's this whole spectrum from like psychopathological to really healing and healthy. So when, Cody Nakoti's book.
Cody, I've talked to Cody about this, and myself especially, but everybody in the Harvard group and Cody and Bryce that I've talked to, none of us are saying psychedelics are the only method. They're just one of the least understood methods as of late, and really open the door to looking more at, the ritualistic aspects that lead to these altered states of consciousness or these different spiritual awakenings. So none of us are arguing that psychedelics were the cause of every single one of Joseph's visions, of any of these early people's visions, just that they are the most reliable, it seems like, and that they actually were a lot more widespread. And, some people say, oh, well, psychedelics might be the easy way to get there. Well, no, because after the fact, you still have to do all of the work. And it seems like in Joseph's case, he used them especially frequently early on, and as time went on, he used them less and less. So as he got better at navigating those states, as he got better at getting into those states, and could turn it on and off at will, essentially, by the end of it, he stopped relying on psychedelics as a means for himself, not necessarily for others. But many people, didn't have the same background or spiritual abilities that Joseph had, and so psychedelics kind of brought up the baseline, whereas before, only 10% of the congregation or whatever would see the heavens open when Joseph opened the heavens for everybody, whereas you throw psychedelics in and all of a sudden 80 or 90% of the congregation is being able to see the vision that Joseph's producing. So they're by far not the only method. They might not even be the best method for some people, but they are a very reliable method out of many of different ways of achieving these sorts of same destinations, as you were saying.
And I think, at least from my perspective, the focus on that there is this state, this mystical state, that in some ways doesn't matter actually how you get there, because you've got fMRI studies that are showing psilocybin and meditation doing the same thing in the brain, and these people reporting such, the psilocybin experience with Roland Griffiths, is the experience they're having is indistinguishable from the experiences that religious mystics have had, that could have involved this, or could have involved fasting or lying in a cave or whatever. And so I think that's really helpful overall to say, like, hey, there's this phenomenon, and kind of talk about the philosophical, metaphysical implication of it. And it doesn't actually matter how they got there, but it's actually pretty likely that they used these ways. I think approaching both of those, and it's difficult because, psychedelics are drugs, and there's so much of a stigma in general, but particularly in church, So I think that's difficult because it sounds so, it's as crazy as, sounds as crazy as saying that Joseph Smith did heroin and that's how he got all these like beautiful, things that are meaningful and inspiring to people, because we just categorize it into drugs.
Right.
So
Right.
Yeah, in large part due to kind of the filter that we've lived under in the West, especially in the U.S. with the war on drugs and the things that came out of the 20th century about categorizing them. I think even historians that have looked into the origins of Mormonism and the Great Awakening in those time periods may have neglected psychoactive substances or other things like that because of just living under that narrative that
Right. Well, they
they're,
did. Like
yeah.
Mike Quinn, incredible early Mormonism magic worldview. Brilliant historian, just absolute giant, unparalleled. Completely missed the psychedelic aspect because he wasn't familiar with it. It wasn't his area of expertise. He didn't understand the language, and so he just completely
Yeah.
missed it.
and it's something that like the mystical experience or these states of consciousness, if you haven't experienced it, like you have no clue. um you don't know what you don't know, so you can't you can't understand what salt tastes like unless you've had it, and you can't describe it to somebody else. And so there is some aspect of that which I think also makes it very difficult, that you can live your whole life and just not be aware of this because it's so poorly known, and also it's just something that can't be described very well. I mean, it can be described, but because that's one of the aspects of it, is that it
Right.
transcends the constructs of language.
I remember when I was given a presentation on this topic at the BYU philosophy department, a number of students came in and whatnot, and none of them could even wrap their mind around the experience itself. They were like, well, the closest they could even compare it to is a dream. And while, yeah, take your most vivid dream and you might semi be in the ballpark of getting a sense of what a psychedelic vision is like, because dreams feel real, psychedelic visions feel real, but they just couldn't even wrap their minds around the concept of this brilliant visionary
Mhm.
experience, period. And so
But I think,
without that, they have nothing to compare it to or be able to work it into their worldview because it's just so out of possibility for them.
and the dream thing is interesting because I think it's almost going in the other direction. Like if you think about your dream and how filmy and hazy that is, and then think about as if that was your life, and then you woke up into quote unquote real life, because these near death experiences. I know my experience with the Kundalini awakening, like it felt exactly like that. Like when I was going through the most intense part of it, I was like, oh, this is a clarity and a level of reality that everything else actually felt like it was a dream. And so that's these near death experiences or these psychedelic experiences. They all have a lot of overlap, but that's one of the qualities that's often reported is it's realer than real. And that's what I struggle with. These again, people that probably don't have experience in mystical experiences, or they talk about it's the spiritual eye and Martin Harris. This is all just like a guided meditation. That could be true, but it's kind of blurring the fact that yes, you can have guided meditation, you can do those things, and you can close your eyes and kind of experience things. But then there are also other types of experiences that feel realer than real, and so
Wait,
it
can you say
is.
more about the Martin Harrison guided meditation
Well, I
connection?
know, and
What do you mean there?
I know. I think this. I haven't read Grant Palmer's stuff, but I know that some people talk about where with the testimony of the witnesses, specifically the three witnesses, I think some of them have said, no, I didn't see it with my physical eyes. I saw it with my
Yeah,
spiritual eyes. And
right.
so some people have used that and said, well, this is like a guided meditation. He's not, they
Oh,
could have just closed their eyes, and Joseph Smith could have kind of, well, you
it
see,
was a guided
are you seeing
psychedelic
this?
experience.
Yeah. And so what I guess what I'm saying is that, um, feels a little bit discounting if you just talk about it being spiritualized and in your head. And that's what I struggle with. Also, this when people talk about psychedelics as hallucinogens or hallucinations, as though it's a aberration that's not real, but like your real life is real. Because if you look at, if you listen to Sam Harris's interviews with these neuroscientists or Lex Friedman, and they talk about how our brains construct reality, it's it's a screen that we're piecing together something based on input. And with psychedelics, with these other experiences, it's just really giving you some interesting input that your brain is throwing stuff up on that screen that is trying to do its best to figure things out and put icons up there. But it's the same process as how we render real life.
Yeah, it's there's a relativity aspect. You don't know how much your brain is making your reality look and feel and behave in the ways that it is until you're in a state of mind where those things are vastly different. And it's really hard to comprehend that, which I always thought after an experience where reality had shifted, coming back, the question was, well, how much of this is actually, it? So I think that's what's one of the things that we'll know as we study more of that kind of states of mind and the psychedelic environment. It's interesting. The Harvard group you're involved with, Alex, we'll be looking forward to hearing more come out of that. I'm curious about in your past from where you were interested in Mormonism. Like, where does that start? Are there some milestones you could look at or things you stumbled across that started that kind of insatiable appetite to know more about it, to keep studying it? Because it seems to me that there's a level of understanding Mormon history, especially as a believing member, let's say, where you get comfortable with it. You may not be interested in learning more unless it's some kind of faith promoting, story of something with the kind of the happy ending. So where does that come in for you?
Yeah, well, so I've always had an insatiable appetite to understand things. Mormonism, in particular, really kicked off when I was about 15. I had a dream. I dreamed a dream, or in other words, I saw a vision where I saw Jesus and the concourse of angels, and he came down and we had a conversation. And I woke up from that experience going, holy heck, what did I just see? Because, no swearing, because Mormon still. And became essentially obsessed with this idea of the second anointing and having the comforter with you all the time, sort of thing, and really understanding what Joseph was doing. And so as a teenager, I got in really interested in like apologetics and reading everything the prophets have written. And that ended up morphing, and I started studying like biblical criticism and history of the Bible and whatnot, and um, went through a sort of faith transition in the process, and got really interested in general mythology and um, understanding the mind. And well, I've always been interested in consciousness too. And then the psychedelics happened as I was suffering debilitating anxiety and depression my entire life. I was seeing a psychiatrist and nothing was working. We tried the entire concourse of antidepressants. We were on the last one. It stopped working. He's like, well, there's this thing called ketamine we can try. And I was like, sure, let's do it. What is it? And a week later, I had my first ketamine experience, and I came out of it and was like, Joseph was on drugs. Like, it makes perfect sense now.
It all
And
fits together.
and this was during my undergrad, and I just dove headfirst into psychedelic research, into all the trainings I could get on it, and just kind of exploded from there. And the connection with Mormonism has just been becoming clearer and clearer as time has gone on. So, I've really just kind of always had this insatiable curiosity for what reality is and what's my place in it, what's your place in it, how do things fit together. And consciousness and has just been kind of the overarching connection. Religion and altered states of consciousness was the other sort of second pillar of my life, and psychedelics kind of merged them together pretty well.
Can you tell us, you'd mentioned, we were talking earlier about uh, a journey through atheism and Denver Snuffer.
Oh yeah.
And then where you've ended up with your own kind of cosmology, philosophy,
Yeah, so
spirituality.
my first step out was I graduated high school to go on a mission early because the age change had shifted, like the year prior, and I submitted my papers. Perfect Mormon boy. Never heard anyone like this, but I my bishop got a call and said, "Well, we weren't sure what to do with this guy's case, so we prayed about it and we're sending it up to the 70, and they're going to pray about it and we'll get back to you." And I was like, "What? This is we were all just confused this entire time." 2 weeks later, he gets another call. Oh, they didn't know what to do, so it's getting pushed up to the Quorum of the Apostles, and they're going to pray about it at the next temple session, and we'll get back to you. And they pushed it up again, claimed the first presidency were going to pray about it in their temple meeting, and then we'd hear about it the following Sunday. Well, following Sunday, get called in for my stake president, hands me a letter. It says, I've been, just generic letter, I've been honorably excused. And I was like, what? Like, at the time, I was like, oh, well, the atonement will cover this. This sucks. And it just kind of broke us. And I was like, well, shoot, maybe they did make a mistake or whatever. And so I went to BYU, or I'd already been admitted to BYU. So that spring, I enrolled and just kept mulling it over, got ostracized pretty badly at BYU for not going on a mission, even though I was honorably excused and had all the same blessings. But apparently not
because they were all wondering what you did, and
right.
Yeah.
Even though there was nothing, whatever. I kind of had just kept exploring, and I came across like Rock Waterman's blog, Pure Mormonism, back in the day, and was like, holy
what's
shit.
that?
He was one of the early like bloggers of the Remnant movement. He like took on like tithing and like charity and polygamy, although I disagree with him on polygamy now. But he kind of was just setting up like what the Book of Mormon says Mormonism should be. Really early on, it was a really fascinating blog. I think I haven't read it in a number of years because it got really political when Trump showed up, and I just didn't care for it anymore. But it was through him I got introduced to the Remnant movement. And the fundamental premise of the Remnant movement is essentially, everybody can achieve the second anointing. Everybody can see God and Jesus in this life. And I was like, well, hey, that's what I'm all about. And they said Joseph Smith was a prophet, and but Brigham Young kind of went off the rails. So they believe that like the Book of Mormon is divine scripture. The Doctrine and Covenants up until Joseph died is also scripture, and then Denver Snuffer kind of became the head, not exactly prophet. I mean, he is a prophet, and it kind of centered around him, but it was more like decentralized for a little while. But then it got centralized, and I had a bunch of disagreements with how they were interpreting scripture, given I'd been studying scripture for academically as well. And so I just kind of ended up breaking from them and didn't really believe in anything for a little while, and kind of moved into this atheism and then agnosticism, and then started doing like psychedelics, and was like, okay, well, there's something else going on there. And it's sort of slowly morphed, and I mean, it's now, and I have been for a while, a practicing polytheist. So, a Mormon God exists, Odin exists, Jupiter exists, Hera exists, like all the gods exist, and I just, pick and choose which ones I want to work with.
So in that real quick, because I think to me, 2 years ago, that would sound crazy, because I was from a materialist perspective of like, well, no, they either do exist or they don't. But let me summarize what I think let me see if I can describe it, and you let me know if this is right or wrong. So we've talked about like idealism versus materialism on this podcast. Do you feel like you fit into idealism, or what's your? Okay.
I'm pretty middle. Like, one of my things is I'm constantly sort of evolving and morphing my view of things depending on what's making sense. So idealism makes sense. The one thing that doesn't make sense is like strict materialism. I
Hmm.
wouldn't say I'm a full-fledged idealist, um, but I do have sort of some idealist leanings and tendencies, and I definitely, there are aspects of it that resonate with me.
Okay.
So I'm
So
kind of middle of the road.
from an idealist perspective, that doesn't sound too crazy in the sense that like idealism is this idea that universe is made of consciousness, like that's the substance of the universe. It's made of one thing, and that material, physical matter, comes through consciousness, comes from consciousness, and that basically the universe is mental. It is a mind. The cosmos is a mind, and that we are um, parts, fractalized parts of that mind, and that we are connected to the universal mind. And that's these ideas of universal unconscious, like Jung talked about, or the book of life, or the Akashic field, this kind of spiritual plane. And then to me, what's the easiest way to make sense of this is looking at psychology and like the models of dissociative identity disorder, or multiple personality disorder, where you have this example that, well, I guess first, this idea that matter comes from consciousness sounds super weird, but dreams, are an example of where like one consciousness, your brain, your mind, goes into a state of consciousness where like there's a part of it that's playing the main character, and then all the rest of the brain is playing these other characters and the background, and they're all actually coming from one meta mind, but the perspective, the consciousness you're experiencing has no clue that it's coming from the same source as the others. And in a dream too, since this is, you're feeling physical matter, if somebody in the dream told you that it wasn't physical matter, you'd say it's crazy, or that it came from mind or some mental process, that would sound crazy because you're experiencing it, but you're experiencing it through consciousness. So there's a dissociative identity disorder, another example where like there's one mind and there's a bunch of different clumps of kind of networks that think that they're separate from each other. So in this idea, with the dream, you can have all these different levels of it. When you wake up, we could be considered part of this cosmic dream. So in that perspective, that what is real, physical matter, the ideas we believe in, God, whatnot, are this sort of intersubjective reality of what all the different parts of the consciousness or the mind believe in. And to whatever degree people believe in that, it kind of creates this stronger network, or this entity, energy, power, whatever you want to believe.
Right.
And that's where, and that provides a context for, Mormonism isn't true or false. People pray to God, their Mormon perspective of God. They do their practices and they have genuine, powerful experiences. Some of them, yes, sure, maybe they're elevation emotions. I felt the Book of Mormon, I felt peace, so I must think that's true. But other people have these crazy stories where they hear voices and it turns out to be true, and that would be a way to more logically, I think, grok what you're saying without saying, "Oh, that sounds crazy," because these are either true or they're not.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a strict dichotomy like that. I think there's a whole spectrum of true and truth and whatnot. But I, I do resonate with, this idea that there is this universal mind and that the universe is consciousness. And I do occasionally, well, yeah, I flip flop, but I do resonate with the idea that, all the gods are just different manifestations of a different part of this universal unconscious. Um, and, but I don't think that they're merely like there's a tendency to psychologize polytheism lately, where they say, oh well, the gods are just a different part of your mind, and so of your own mind, and so when you're interacting with the gods, you're just interacting with another part of yourself, and that's separate from interacting with the universal consciousness or whatever. So they're saying, oh no, it's just a part of your head, and that's, while that's still sort of real, it's localized. I don't think that's useful or really helpful. I started out that way, but now I've kind of morphed to, it could be this universal consciousness that each of the gods are a part of, but there's also something else going on there, I think, with all of these things.
And to me, it's you can go either direction. I mean, you can go out, see
Right.
things outside of you, but then if you go into the subconscious and these automatic writing things, some of it's from the personal unconscious, I think, as Jung would call it, but then there's a layer underneath that, this universal unconscious that goes back out to encompass. So like the whole is within the part, because it's this holographic
Right.
idea.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of like the net of Indra sort of idea of that everything's connected, and that, you know, each of us are essentially a node in this net, and each node is a jewel. So if you shine a light, like a laser beam, into the jewel, the ones you're more connected with light up more brightly, and the further away the connection is, the less bright the light is. And so you can sort of modulate what influences you and what you're a reflection of more than we'd otherwise say that we could. And so in that sense, we're all interconnected and a part of this bigger net, and we're all a part of this bigger consciousness in some way or another, and we're reflecting back everything around us back to itself, sort of way. So I do definitely resonate with those sorts of like everything's interconnected approaches, and I think they're extremely beneficial, especially in our hyper atomized society today.
Yeah. Indra's net of jewels. That's an idea that emerged out of Hinduism, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
one visualization is a spider web that's got dewdrops all inside of it. And the reflection of all the other dewdrops are seen through just a single dewdrop. So it's a very fractal kind of perspective that I like as well. I resonate with
Right.
that as well. That the information of everything is contained in a single part of it at some level because of entropy, right? The
Right. Well,
arrow of time.
that's another reason I think Joseph for sure was doing psychedelics, is he became so like communal based that I've got a couple papers coming out in Journal of Mormon History later this year on Joseph's tithing and his communitarian and Zionistic practices. But he really, went to this idea that, the church is either all saved together. All of the members existing in the church are either saved together or they're all damned together. Everything, they were all connected to each other. And that's why, one of the reasons that he started like polygamy and whatnot is this idea of the great chain of being and linking everyone together, linking everyone up to God. And he really, really hammered in on this idea of interconnection that most people don't get without a psychedelic or profound mystical experience, which is one of the reasons that I think people arguing that Joseph never had a genuine mystical experience or something completely missed the mark, is he has all the telltale signs of someone who had a genuine mystical or psychedelic experience.
yeah, I mean, that was again, mine was endogenous, but that was uh, a feeling that I was having. I was like, oh, we're all one, this kind of communal, um, felt like there was this period where I was like, this beggar is asking for money. Like, this is a kind of this test for me, because this person's me. And, you have to balance that. But yeah, so I think that's definitely part of the mystical experience, which again, psychedelics is a fairly reproducible path for it. Yeah, and I agree too. This is something I wrote about and is in episode 2, is that the idea that Joseph Smith, that the first vision or these mystical experiences are all made up doesn't make sense, because in research they've got a few different scales, but the mystical experience scale, the MEQ, and they have these different hallmarks of mystical experience: ineffability, difficult, inability to describe in words, this unitive experience, bliss, transcending time and space, all these things that you see in the first vision, I think in the different accounts, and in some of the Doctrine and Covenants things, where it's checking these boxes that it would be very unlikely, I think, somebody that didn't have experience with this from one way or the other to somehow create stuff that checked all those boxes, because those aren't necessarily intuitive things, and they don't always, they don't necessarily fit into Mormon cosmology. I mean, there's that Doctrine and Covenants verse where he's talking about, you're in and of God and all around. So there's some interesting things that just, I think, logically doesn't make sense to dismiss it.
Right. Well, and
Uh,
not only himself, but he was doing it in others, and that's why psychedelics are such a good candidate for what Joseph was doing. Is he could reliably produce visions on demand for dozens, if not hundreds, of other people. So he could somehow invoke mystical experiences in all of these other people, which is unheard of. Like maybe the super powerful evangelical preachers or whatever, the televangelists, seem to play on emotions and get something like that. But to be able to produce like genuine mystical experiences that people continued to not deny even after they disavowed Joseph and Mormonism, like those particular experiences, and that he could have these groups of people who went through immense amounts of suffering, that threats on their life, death, loss of family members, leaving their family for years. Nobody's going to do that because of just a basic charismatic leader. Like there was something to their faith, and there was something to the experiences that they had, and they were having these genuine mystical experiences, and Joseph was facilitating these in entire groups of people.
yeah, and I think that's the best evidence for psychedelics being the modality in those experiences. I think personally with him, I had just read the Sword of Laban, the Dissociated Mind of Joseph Smith Jr., I think is what it's called. And that's this Freudian analysis by William Moraine, who is a plastic surgeon and had a lot of experience with kids that had burns, and then the dissociation that was produced because of that just intense experience, where their minds essentially kind of quarantined, walled off the part of their psyche that protected the rest from that experience. And so he really focuses in on Joseph Smith's intense surgeries, 3 surgeries, 4, I think, if you count the lancing without anesthesia, where they're cutting down to the bone, and he explains everything from that Freudian, just the personal psyche, doesn't tie in any metaphysical, nothing Jungian about it. But I think there is some basis to that, because a lot of people that have these experiences, there is a connection to trauma, but specifically that type of trauma, and that dissociative process, I think, could mean that he was able to do a lot on his own. But in the end, I don't know that it really matters so much with him. And I don't know if the Book of Mormon was him just getting into that dissociative state that he learned how to stabilize, or whether there were substances involved in that. I think with the Book of Mormon, there's so many other accounts of other automatic writing that's like housewives or other things that probably weren't using psychedelics, that I don't know that you need it. And I have friends that do, Akashic Records readings, that they don't use any substances. They're just able to get into that state. I don't think it needs to be involved there, but it could be. And then, with his, there's accounts in D. Michael Quinn's Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview where you realize, something was going on. Like these were experiences where there's a toad in the box that is turning into an angel and like slapping him and then he's telling other people about that. I mean, if this was a big fraud, a con, you probably wouldn't approach it that way. And so something was going on. I think this makes the most sense too for why, I think if it was all a fraud and he made it all up, I just don't think, I think there is something to what Jeffrey R. Holland's saying is that, like, why would a man die for like this book? I think that he believed a lot of what he taught. And I think he believed that there really were Nephites and Lamanites. I don't think he had, physical place. I think he really come to realize that they were like a spiritual artifact in some other realm. And then he just channeled it in, made some props for other people. And it makes the most sense for him to really believe it. And psychedelic experiences, I think, are the only way that, or the main way that somebody would really believe something that other people wouldn't objectively experience or see.
Right. Yeah. And being able to just have so many of these other people die for him and say,
and give up their property too. I mean, I think that if you have this mystical experience, you're feeling this oneness of like, that's when you're like, I'm part of this. I'm going to give up my property. I'm going to give it to this communal group. That's
right. Right. Yeah, exactly. Especially, when the church was smaller early on and psychedelics were that much more frequent. It makes perfect sense. You got a small group and, oh no, he is me and I am him and we're saved together and he's suffering. So let me give him the clothes off my back sort of thing. It makes way more sense.
Real quick, back to Denver Snuffer. So people may not be familiar. So second anointing, the second comforter, the calling election being made sure, this idea in Mormonism that there's another ordinance. At some point you've passed the test and you can get your exaltation sealed to the highest degree, celestial kingdom. There's nothing you can do that's going to take that from you except denying the Holy Ghost, which I don't really know what that actually means, or maybe killing somebody. And this
depends on who you kill.
This is an actual, shedding of innocent blood, I guess. This is an actual ordinance that has had a history of the church being more popular than it dwindled down during David O. McKay. And then Mormon Stories has some interesting episodes on it. There's Tom Phillips, who was he's a stake president, I think, and he got the second anointing and then fell away from the church. And Hans Matson talks about getting the second anointing. It was a really powerful experience for him. He was an area authority, somebody that then left the church. But it involves the women washing the feet, the general authority or apostle washing the feet of the person, and the wife washing the feet of the husband, and then the wife giving the husband a blessing. And it's a thing, which is, but part of this, one of the things Tom Phillips... It's
the Mormon equivalent of doing so well in the class that you do the calculation and you can bomb the final and still pass.
That's a good analogy.
And Tom Phillips, his story was, one of the things he said that was interesting was he's like, okay, am I going to see Jesus at the temple? And then he didn't. And so he's pretty disappointed and trying to figure out what that meant. But so that's, part of
before he went.
So part of the, cosmology or the doctrines in Mormonism is that you see Christ comes and ministers to you personally. And then I don't know much about Denver Snuffer, but my understanding is that he's had these visitations of angels and of Christ. And he's a convert to the church, but then I think he was talking about these things, wrote this book, The Second Comforter. And the
While
church
he
is
was
like,
still a member.
yeah. And he's a lawyer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, a reputable person, but writing these books and then got excommunicated. But yeah, his opinion or his he's like, why aren't we having these things? You know, these are things in the doctrine that we can have these visitations. Why'd they all stop? Which, you know, a good reason. If they were using psychedelics in the early church, that would be a reason why things would stop. And that we can all have them. So what would you, is that a summary, a decent summary of his main?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's been, like 8 or 9 years since I was associated with them, I think. So I haven't really kept up with them much.
What do you, I mean, to me, I hear him, and I haven't read any of his books, but I hear him talk, and I'm like, oh yeah, this fits exactly into like this research on spontaneous spiritual awakenings, Kundalini
Yeah.
awakenings.
Well, he's speaking at Sunstone, I think. I think he's like 2 presentations after mine. So I'm
Oh, I
gonna
didn't see that
see
he
if I can
was.
find him and invite him to mine and go to his and see if I can talk to him about it. Because I'm really curious what he thinks of these things. My guess is he's probably against them, but that's from my knowledge from way back when I was talking with everybody that was involved in the groups and whatnot.
I think that's the difficulty with these things is like you. So the nature of these experiences are that they come through the filters, depending on how much your personal mind is still there. That it's filtered through your mind, and so that's why I think these alien, cryptid, Sasquatch, encounters. Like, what's the difference between seeing an alien and seeing an angel? You know,
Well,
they
that was the
both come from up
brilliance of
there.
Yeah, that was the brilliance of Joseph Smith. Was he he really was a ritual genius. Like the church talks about him as this uneducated farm boy, and sure, maybe he didn't have a super great official education. Although Hiram, his brother, went to Dartmouth and probably brought that back to Joseph and whatnot. But even so, like Joseph was this ritual genius. He was able to synthesize sort of the cultural milieu. He was able to synthesize together that with his occult readings, his working within like Methodism and his parents' religions, and synthesize all of that, and then develop these rituals where he could reliably produce visions or similar visions in other people through, like the school of the prophets and the development of the temple ceremony and whatnot. He built a ritual that was designed to promote the same experience in everybody, regardless of their own, personal consciousness. He
So
built,
he had set and setting down.
yeah, exactly, way before it was a thing. He had set
Mm-hmm.
and setting down, and he even somehow figured out how to account for, the individual variations in experience and whatnot. And as the church grew, that became harder and harder to account for because there's more and more diverse members. But he had the ritual down. So give someone a psychedelic, put them in this, and they'll come out saying this, using similar language, using saying that they saw very similar things, and that's accounted in the schools of the
Mm-hmm.
prophets. It's accounted in the individual visions. It's accounted in the visions occurring surrounding the Kirtland Temple dedication and up through the Nauvoo period. So the guy was a genius, and I've got mad respect for his ability to work with these substances, develop these rituals, get everybody on board with a very similar worldview, despite the fact that they're all coming from all of these different backgrounds and bringing in their baggage. And somehow, he's able to incorporate that and spin it in a way that works for them. And he was doing that when he was doing his communalism, when he and the other saints moved from New York to Kirtland first. There was already the existent Morley Farm, the communitarian system there,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a lot of the debates that we get in the DNC 40 and 50 sections. Is he's figuring out how to synthesize and bring their approach in line with what he's envisioning, and everybody kind of culminated and came around this mostly similar definition of what communitarianism was, and then they went with that. And he did that with visions. He did that with all aspects of the theology. Like, the guy was a genius. There's no other way around it. Like, and
Yeah.
it wasn't. I mean, sure, church members will be like, "Oh, well, yeah, God inspired it all." Well, okay, yeah, God inspired it. God put him in this circumstances, and he used all of those circumstances to create this. Because Joseph was a 19th century product of the occult. He was a 19th century product of the Native American lore at the time. He was a product of the different religious people at the time. The political, like his debates in tithing are very much contextualized within the debates happening in tithing around the country and even from England. So the guy was just a genius. There's no other way around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to wrap up this Denver Snuffer thing, I think his so what they're experiencing exactly falls under and is accounted for these experiences, and so your brain's filtering things what you expect. So set and setting, I guess we should say, the two main aspects that they've talked about influencing a psychedelic experience, because psychedelics basically amplify your mind, your consciousness, what's going on there. And so set being your intention, kind of what you're bringing into your mind, setting being the outside stimulus. You can correct me if I'm butchering this, but those are the two, and that's why having somebody guiding you, expecting to see a certain thing, having your own cosmology that is going to be filtered through, that influences the experience.
I don't think that's always the case. I think that's a lot of the buzzwords right now, and a lot of the cultural conversations around that is the case, but I don't think, and while that is the case to an extent, in my experience and with the people I've talked to and stuff, there's also a completely outside sort of influence coming into it. So I don't think they're the non-specific amplifiers that like Huxley and a lot of people are sort of coming around to today. I think they can be, but they aren't necessarily that. But that's an aside. So
I agree with that. Stan Groff's talking about astrology, and then Christopher Bache's book. There's kind of this. It's what you need at that time, which may not be your set or your setting. But like, this is what the universe. This is what your personal development needs, and so that's going to be what's served up. But yeah, I think what's unfortunate with having these amazing experiences or powerful experiences, and then just getting having so much tunnel vision and not contextualizing, okay, well, if I'm experiencing this, like, well, maybe the Catholics that are seeing the Virgin Mary, and I don't know as much about Hinduism, Buddhism, but them seeing their gods, and maybe this all fits within this meta framework, which is tough to do when you have such a narrow conclusion from it that there's this one religion that's the teaching this thing. But this is an interesting thing. I find that the apologists, both the apologists and the anti-Mormon, they both acknowledge that other experiences were happening around them, around Joseph Smith at that time. Yet neither side really wants to make any accounting for it. They use it maybe to some to their own advantage, particularly like quote unquote anti-Mormon stuff, because they're like, well, there's nothing unique about Joseph Smith because all these other people have this experience, and yet. Okay, well, like, how do you account for those other experiences? Like, are those people narcissists that are making up the experiences as well? These little, much harder people to classify as, oh, this is their agenda. They're trying to get rich. They're trying to make a church, whatnot. Like, no, there's some people that just had these experiences. Same thing with automatic writing. They'll say, well, Book of Mormon is just like all these other things that are inexplicable. But then, like, how do you account for that?
Right. Exactly. So. Well, and it's something about taking people and their experiences for face value. Like, that's a problem within both Mormon culture and in ex-Mormon cultures. In Mormon culture, it's either God or the devil, and all of these positive experiences that other religions are having. And this was especially problematic, with McConkie and the Catholic Church being devils, is, oh, well, all of their experiences are devilish. They can't possibly be real or authentic. And then you have the ex-Mormons who are angry about things, who come along and say, well, yeah, you're all just hallucinating and imagining things and whatnot.
It's
And it's
all
like,
elevation emotion. It's
yeah,
all
you're completely
neurobiology, neurophysiology.
discounting people's experiences. Like,
Hmm.
and I wrote a post on my Substack like a month ago because I get frustrated by this. And I think I titled it like, "There's too much truth," and that's a good thing, because if you take everybody's experience seriously and be like, okay, well, yeah, so my neighbor saw Virgin Mary. Yep, they saw Virgin Mary. Or, okay, my neighbor saw Bigfoot. Yeah, all right, cool, they saw Bigfoot. Or, you experience oneness. Yeah, you experience that. That's awesome. That's when life gets interesting, is when you start to be like, oh, this person has this different kind of experience. I wonder what's leading them to have this. Like, why are they experiencing this, and why am I experiencing this? Whereas if you just blanket statement, oh, okay, well, my experiences are of God and theirs are of the devil, that's boring. Or, oh, well, they're all just hallucinating. Well, that's boring. Like, you're just making reality so boring. Whereas if you take these things seriously, aliens exist, UFOs exist. Wow, that's incredible. Okay, how do we understand this? How do we explain this? Like, the I had a friend introduce me to the world of ufology the other day, and like the amount of philosophical thought that goes into it, and the classification of ontologies, it's incredible. But it's the same with like all of these different religious experiences. Like, there's the classic trope of, the atheist talking to the Christian. The Christian's like, well, yeah, there's one God, there's God, and the atheist is like, well, what about all those others? Oh, well, they're all just fake. And the atheist is like, well, I just believe in one less God than you. Well, me, well, no, I'll take them all as face value. I'll take them all. People having experiences with them, cool. All right, tell me about it. Like, let's figure it out. Like, why are our experiences similar? Why are they different? Where are they different? Why are these people having the exact same experiences of Odin? Like, why? It,
Hmm.
it makes it so much more fun. And it's the
Yeah.
same with, like, when we take Mormon experiences seriously and Joseph Smith's theology seriously. Like, it's so much fun.
Yeah. Why are people experiencing the same entities
Yeah.
on DMT?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think kind of tying in what you've both been talking about, this whole idea of set and setting, and maybe in other times in the past, in villages or in places where people were collected together, they had some kind of medicine man or someone that could rise to the occasion of like a spiritual guide, using plant medicine, using the healing substances around them, and just being inspired by the creation. And then it seems like if we zoom up part of the fractal, from the individual, or from the like the village and the shaman who emerges out of them, somewhere these shamans emerge out of us. Call it Joseph Smith, call it Buddha, uh, call it Jesus Christ, but someone that emerges out, that's like, if the human family is all kind of arrayed as a landscape, these are the mountains, the monolithic structures that stand out as guideposts. And they're like, the way that you're talking about Joseph Smith as a ritual genius, being the one to gather all of that current milieu and put it in the context of whatever languages we've got, which are religion often, and then just being like that shamanic guide for a
Right.
whole swath of people. Take it seriously to that level, and then you just start to see that we're all just doing that, to like repeating doing that
Right.
Yeah. And
throughout time.
that's what I'm reading Stan Grof's book. And he's talking about shamans, how, the difference between the shamanic initiation is something which is spontaneous and, plunges the shaman through hell, and then they descend that and, transcend into heaven. And then they are able to then create a initiation rite for other people, which is something that is planned and supported. And it's different than the shamanic initiation.
Right.
And so, and that's what Joseph Smith,
Yeah.
that's what we're talking about Joseph Smith doing.
Yeah.
Well, for a long time, it was the guys that could go out and get the animals to bring them back to feed the rest of us, or whoever that was going and doing that, going into the 3D world and bringing back the protein of the body, like the substance of the body. Then when we became established and got into more complex spiritual kind of rituals and routines and thought processes, then it was the shaman who could go, who'd been on the other side, who'd like done it, and who could come back returning with something of value, that hero's journey. And then they're like, I've been there, I've done that. Jesus is the one that did that with death. You know, one of us that emerged out that did that with death.
That's an interesting analogy with the hunter and then the shaman. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I like that. And that's one of the difficulties too, is getting people to recognize Joseph as one of those mountains, like you were saying, Eldon. Is
well,
like,
yeah, that's why I love hearing your perspective. The anti-Mormon, he's a fraud. The full believing Mormon, he's the guy in the video that is like the most charismatic guy in town. You know, it's like those two narratives are as true in their universes as any other in any one of our universes. In my universe, it's like that. It's true that there are prophets that emerge out of us and can do what I'm trying to describe here. That's what's true. It's not that what he was saying necessarily to the details that we've taken it now in the form of a religion. It's like religion's the business that follows the spirituality.
Right.
When I think, so then the next, to me, the next logical step or next important thing that comes from accepting that Joseph Smith was having mystical experiences from whatever modality is that, you know, his motivation, I guess, then for what he did. If you understand mystical experiences and the research on them and the, you know, again, in episode 6, we talked about these spontaneous spiritual awakenings and Kundalini awakenings and just how profoundly positive they are to those people. And, you know, if you really are feeling this oneness and this connection with everybody and this Christ-like love for people, you know, then I think that changes this narrative of Joseph Smith is this unidimensional person that is just a fraud and he just wanted sex and power and was just, you know, no, I think
and some people
need
very
that conflicted
as they leave the church. But yeah, sorry, keep going, Gabe.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was very conflicted. And I mean, I go back and forth between just thinking of, you know, reading some of the stuff, the happiness letter, or, you know, what him convincing somebody to marry Brigham Young.
He definitely thought with his dick on a number of occasions. And there's no way around that. And that's the problem is most Mormons, you know, they deify him as this almost perfect human being. And so they only look at the good stuff or it's only the will of God. And then you have the ex-Mormons who are like, oh, he was a charlatan. He was a con man, a fraud. Well, no. Yes, he was to some extent a con man. He was to some extent fraudulent, especially when it came to monetary dealings. He was a very sexual human being and was very much driven by his dick on many occasions. But so is everybody else. And I get that we have to contrast the narrative of this perfection to this evil guy, but if you look at him as a human, there are aspects of him that I like, that I would get along with really well, and there are aspects where I won't touch with a 10-foot pole. Like, we would have some major arguments over this. And he did with many members of the church. He and Oliver had a falling out. Not necessarily because of the sex, but because Joseph kept lying about his experiences with Oliver and Fanny Alger and Adeline Fuller. And Oliver was just pissed because he kept lying about it to cover his own ass. Like, he very much liked the nice things and he wanted the nice things. Like, that's very clear. And he took money that he shouldn't have. Brigham was 1,000 times worse in that regard. But people up. And I'm not trying to defend many of his, but people do, and he did many times. But he also did some pretty incredible things and helped a surprising number of people improve on their spiritual journeys, on their physical lives, and helping them navigate their worldly experience, sort of thing. And he still does to some extent. I mean, it's all been distorted, and the church messes up so many things about him and his theology and whatnot. They're missing all the good stuff.
Hmm.
But, I mean, yeah, he was a human
Well,
too.
and the one thing that, I think this sort of Laban book was pretty limited by just being psychoanalytic, but the one thing that I got out of it was, it had this really, it was really moving, and had a lot of compassion, empathy for him, thinking, I've got a 6-year-old boy, and just thinking about, my boy going through these surgeries and, feeling abandoned by his mother who left, being held down by his father.
And not
And
taking the alcohol to make a point to his alcoholic father. Yeah, so in the process of going through his own pain, he's also trying to make a statement to his alcoholic father and show his father, like, hey, you can do things sober. So it's like the poor kid.
and then afterwards he's sent away to his uncle to heal with the ocean air or whatever.
Well,
Thinking,
I think he enjoyed that, and it was probably good for him. Like, so I've got some research coming out on Joseph and Jesse Smith's trip to Salem right after the surgery. But so I think I don't necessarily think that was a bad thing, or that he wasn't looking forward to it. I mean, I
Well,
obviously don't know his mind, but I think it was a much more positive experience than we might think.
and it's just the fact that we're looking at it from different perspectives rather than it being a coin, heads or
Mm-hmm.
tails, fraud or profit. That there's a coin involved. He's a three-dimensional person. He's like Fritz Haber, the guy that used nitrogen in the fertilizer application that made it so we could basically
Oh
feed the
yeah,
population growth that happened in the 20th century. He's the guy that made it possible through that discovery of using nitrogen the way that he did. Well, he also, I believe, he was the guy that developed some kind of chemical gas agent during the war that he used, that Germany had used to kill thousands. So it's like, what is Fritz Haber? If you talk about him, you talk about that shadow side.
mm-hmm.
But Joseph Smith, it seems like that so much of it has become about talking about one perspective of him for whatever gain that gets you, which is just
Right.
more conflict, rather seeing the going through the middle way, seeing the three-dimensional aspect of who he was
and I
in
think,
Right.
terms of, yeah.
and I, the other thing that I had have a lot of compassion for him is just, it's a difficult navigation for me going through my, Kundalini awakening. Luckily, I had a friend that was familiar with these things, and then was connected with other people that knew about Jung and spirituality and whatnot. With Joseph Smith, he set himself up as the prophet, so it's not like he didn't have a psychedelic integration guide. He didn't have somebody who could say, like, hey, I can't figure out what this means. Um, what do you think? It's like you just had to kind of fake it till you make it. And
I think he
yeah,
did
I
have
think,
guides in, like, Hiram, definitely theologically from Hiram's Dartmouth period, and Lumen Walters was probably a help in integration. And I mean, early on, the church was not meant to be sole prophet. It was co revelators in Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith, and Emma was even supposed to be at the head too. So it wasn't meant early on to be a solo journey, and Joseph recognized that. And even later on, he slowly offloaded more and more responsibility to the 12, which is part of the reason tithing got the way it did, is because he gave it off to the 12 because he couldn't deal with that. But so I think you're right, he did do a significant portion of it alone, but I also think he had more help than
I
people
don't
realize.
think, I think he does have traits that would fall under like narcissism. And I don't think he's the type of person that probably could be vulnerable and say like, hey, I don't understand this. What do you, when you're the leader of a church, it's different than somebody who is experiencing something and they don't think they're supposed to lead a church, but they can go to somebody else and say like, hey, I don't understand this. Help me work through this. So, I think he was in uncharted territory. And so I think, I have compassion for him. And then also, I think that I do see this shadow side of him playing such a big role, this idea of automatic writing as, just from a materialist perspective, you can say it's just coming from the person's subconscious. If you take a more metaphysical, it's their subconscious and like a universal unconscious or connected consciousness. But either of those, there's a lot of subconscious stuff that comes out. And I think that the more and more I think about the Book of Mormon, I'm planning to go back and reading it. This is our best look at his psyche, I think, in that there's a bunch of swords, a bunch of appendages being cut off. There's all these things that he judges so strongly in the Book of Mormon. I think he ends up giving into later, polygamy, Jacob too, and then look what polygamy came to at the end of Mormonism. Just the Lamanite daughters being sex trafficked basically, and then having Stockholm syndrome, and then his young girls that he was marrying. This Nephite, Lamanite, this duality, good, bad, black and white, I think was this shadow side of him. Even Korihor is fascinating because Korihor, is sort of this nihilistic or hedonistic, whatever you do doesn't matter, don't waste, your time following, rules, just do what you want to do. And it was kind of the second anointing, you could make an argument that, it's the happiness letter too. The object of this life is happiness. The Gadianton robbers, that was the biggest thing that happened. And, that was the downfall of the Book of Mormon. And then you've got the Danites at the end of his life. So I think it's, I made a comment yesterday, there's this polygamy thing raging on between, Bill Reel and Michelle Brady Stone and the polygamy deniers, which is an interesting topic in and of itself because, so I made this comment. So these polygamy deniers, polygamy is very repulsive to them. And again, they've had these really strong, powerful experiences with the Book of Mormon, with Joseph Smith. And so they're trying to figure out, was there a way we can kind of ease this mental pain, this cognitive dissonance of, this wasn't Joseph Smith, like a prophet wouldn't do this, because that's the basis of her podcast is that polygamy is not of God. And so if polygamy is not of God, then like essentially that's what she focuses on, but then she's kind of gone to. Yeah. And so, but I made this comment because there's two aspects to this. One is there's this power differential and underage brides and, saying it's from God that's commanding and your salvation's on the line, your family's salvation on the line. But then there's just this other aspect of human sexuality, and it's also so offensive, to this group of polygamy, polyamory, because there's such a hyper focus on sex and sexual purity in Mormonism. And I made this comment of, how would history have been different if Joseph Smith would have been able to tell Emma, like, look, I want to open up our marriage, and then they either figure that out or they divorce or whatnot. But I think there's this shadow side that, that seems to be likely his childhood sins. That I want to get your thoughts on this. I've heard that that's the sins that he was praying for forgiveness before he had the first vision. Could be, but I think that when you repress something and you judge yourself for it, and then it turns into pathological, and then you have to find some way to justify it, and then it's God and an angel with a flaming sword, and then it just goes even more off the rails. And so I think he's a very conflicted person.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And I think an analogy to that actually is Jung. Like Jung described, his personality number one and his personality number two, and they did not necessarily get along. His personality number two is the one that, saw into the eternities and was very much a Gnostic. And then his personality number one that he describes is the one that, you know, discounts Gnosticism. And that's the personality that scientists and researchers have grasped onto of Jung's and sort of deny this personality number two that he's had. And I think Joseph had something very similar. He had this personality number two longing for the eternities and figuring all of that out. And then he had personality number one that was very culturally based, but also was subject to his traumas and his shadow side as well, that ended up giving many things that he did a bad name, or did him under the incorrect guise, or didn't integrate him properly.
Yeah, I think this total lack of awareness of shadow side, and as long as you have Satan that you can throw under the bus for every temptation, and God that you have to give credit for all the good things. I think that's something that still plagues Mormonism today. Is you got to be happy, you got bad thoughts, you got to hum a hymn, and doesn't mean you do the things that you don't. Doesn't mean you follow the shadow side, but you integrate it. You get curious about it, and you have self-compassion.
Well, he after the fact ended up even describing the negative effects of like the psychedelic experience on the body as satanic. He talks about the dry mouth, the inability to speak, being bound. He later attributes that experience, the come up of the psychedelic experience, to the devil, and what came after was God. And he does it again in the group setting in the June 3rd to 4th, 1831 conference, where he gives the sacrament to everybody. It's clearly laced with some sort of psychoactive substance, and Harvey Whitlock comes out of it, and his shoulders are hunched, and his fingers are in the shapes of claws. He can barely speak. His eyes are in the shape black O's or ovals that they say, so his eyes are dilated. And he and Hiram's like, what's going on, Joseph? This isn't of God. And Joseph's like, well, don't speak against it. And Hiram's like, well, okay, if you say this is of God and you ask him, then I'll believe it. And Joseph goes and proceeds to, cast the devil out of Harvey Whitlock, and he goes into someone else, who then somersaults, and then to someone else who has negative side effects. And Joseph says that the reason for this, the explanation he gives, is so that they can understand how Satan works, so that they can build up the fortitude to fight against him. So he is attributing, the negative come up effects of psychedelics, the negative bodily effects, and he's just using the devil as a scapegoat for them, and being like, okay, well, now you know how to know what's the devil and what's God. And so you see the cycle in so many of the visionary experiences, where they have the come up side effects, the physical side effects. The devil is the barrier to entry, and then they overcome the devil and break through into this psychedelic vision, this mystical glory, and the devil just becomes this scapegoat over and over again.
What would you I had also made a comment recently in this Facebook group, the Thoughtful Saints group, and just asking their thoughts on psychedelics and how that integrates into their views. And both ends of the spectrum. how would you say that your experience of psychedelics, how do those map onto the fruits of the spirit? Because Mormonism is so based, as opposed to other Christian sects, of like, it's the feeling, it's the spirit. This is how you know what's good is peace, love, happiness, all these things. And also, by their fruits you shall know them. So, if what's also the effects of psychedelics on a long-term basis. So mapping, what you experience as the Holy Ghost, or what people report feeling as the Spirit of the Holy Ghost, compared to the feelings of psychedelics.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's in one of the papers I've written. That's the argument I make for psychedelics, even within Mormonism, is the argument of by their fruits you shall know them. And the fruits of psychedelics overall are overwhelmingly positive for myself and for many other people. Not to say that they always are, but an increase in love, an increase in empathy, an increase in nature relatedness and caring for the world around you, the people around you. There are all these cases in the clinical trials coming out of people, reconciling with family members, of being more open and loving towards them, of giving a greater portion of themselves to other people. Like if you look at the clinical outcomes of psychedelics and the healing aspects that they have, and we're judging them by their fruits, then it seems like they're a good fruit. I mean, that's obviously not universal, and there are many cases of harm being done with psychedelics or from people who have used psychedelics, but that doesn't mean that the psychedelics themselves are devil's fruit or whatever you want to say. So,
And how about, like, yeah, what people typically talk about as the spirit, with actual experiences within a psychedelic experience?
what do you mean?
In terms of, like, in my endogenous experiences, yeah, that the feelings, not involving any substances, the feelings that I had, I was like, oh, this is like bliss, love. I mean, it's like the spirit
Oh, so like
times
what's psych?
100,000. Yeah, because I mean,
So
that's what people are, that's how you find out if the Book of Mormon is true. That's how the temple is true, because you get there and you get this beautiful, peaceful feeling.
so you're asking like, are
In your experience, how would you map that onto what you used to
mm,
call the spirit in the church, spiritual confirmations, to what you've experienced?
yeah, I mean, it would appear to be positive spiritual confirmations, under the influence of psychedelics. I have an outpouring of love towards myself and fellow man. I have sort of an awe and reverence for God. Like the experiences under psychedelics, especially the positive, but even the negative. Joseph was chastised severely by God and by the Spirit on multiple occasions, and you can kind of
Mm.
compare that to harrowing experiences like that Alma had in the Book of Mormon. You can have these harrowing, painful experiences because of things that you've done wrong or that have happened to you that have been wrong. And I mean, that you could say that still maps onto the spirit, because either you're being chastised or you're realizing the extent of harm that somebody did to you, and how, and being able to forgive them, like that's an extremely common experience in these clinical trials with psychedelics, is people forgiving parents or loved ones who have done them harm, or forgiving themselves for doing harm to others. And I mean, that all sounds like what the scriptures say that the spirit should feel like to me.
Mm. Yeah, one person had commented and asked, like, well, what would you say? Would you say, these experiences, um, you know, connect you with God, and following the commandments of, are these psychedelic experiences, having people follow the commandments of God afterwards? And I was like, well, it depends on what you think the
Love
commandments of
God,
God
love
are.
your neighbor.
Yeah, love God, love
More
your neighbor.
people, more people lean towards, some sort of theism after psychedelics. There's those DMT studies on that. People are way more loving after the fact. So, yep,
Yeah,
definitely
I
makes
said,
all of the commandments better. Love God, love your neighbor, love the universe, love your neighbor.
yeah. So I said, and those, what Christ said were the most important things. Definitely a positive increase, but the other things that are pretty important to a lot of people in terms of like LGBT and moral, the moral backslide of the those things. I think you would find a negative correlation in terms of what you think would be following God. So it'll be interesting, and I think I view this will be an interesting to watch what happens in the church, because I think the church is well-meaning. I think that the authorities, I think they believe it. I think they've probably had powerful spiritual experiences. I think they want people to be happy, and I think they're trying to do what they think is right. And so I think they value mental health, and I think they'll get behind these being MDMA and psilocybin being approved for mental health.
Once they stop fighting against it, they might.
It,
Behind the scenes, they still fight against this stuff, but you know, in front public media, they'll be like, oh yeah, mental health, whatever. So I'll be
I
surprised.
was, yeah, and I don't know the details of that. I had listened to one episode where somebody, I think from the church, had reached out to somebody behind the Utah stuff that was
Yeah,
trying to put forward, and they're kind of asking, and that person had asked the church, was like, well, are you going to get behind this or not? And they didn't give was a non-committal answer. But yeah, I mean, I think that to some degree, if the on a federal level, if they say, hey, if the FDA approves it, um,
in a
but I
medical
think,
setting, then they can get
yeah, in a
behind
medical setting. But then that'll be an interesting thing to tease out, because you've got people that, yeah, are going to be a lot happier, healthier, healing from PTSD, whatnot. But I think that there's going to be a high number of those people that leave the church, because there's this pretty significant
it.
trend,
Right.
I think, towards,
Well, and
um,
this is something I'm working on trying to elucidate. Mormonism needs like a psychedelic chaplaincy the same way Judaism has started to set one up. There's these Jewish rabbis who are working with Jews who have done psychedelics to help them integrate their experiences. There's some, Christian psychedelic chaplaincies being set up in various places and denominations that are helping people integrate these experiences into their existing frameworks, which is something we need and what Joseph was doing. So we need someone to play the role of Joseph Smith again.
but I just think that, there are certain doctrinal beliefs that will be that the church can't move on. I think that an anthropomorphic God that's separate than us, that has a physical body, that doesn't jive with the mystical experience of like, oh, it's all God, we're all connected. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I think the hyper focus on specific prescriptive rules also. So it'll be interesting to see that tension of people that are having positive mental health, and something that initially I think the church will approve of, because I don't think they're aware of this. I don't think it's on their radar at all, of just like mystical experiences and the idea that what they view as the second comforter and these powerful experiences can also be accessed in a non-religious setting. Um, and then you'll have this thing where, how is it, it's from God if it's medically approved and you're going through those channels, but then somebody who's not doing it medically approved, it's from Satan. And that differentiation is just from a stamp of the government that they don't
Right.
necessarily believe is,
Right.
like, is the government God?
There's a lot of theological questions that need to be teased out. Maybe we can do another episode teasing all those out.
Definitely.
Do you think there was any smoking gun with psychedelics and the
We're
early history
getting
of the church?
closer to one. I'm tracking down historical artifacts cups, sacramental cups, chalices, even maybe hair that we could do tests on to see what chemical compounds are existent in them. And that would, satisfy the materialists or whatever. Be like, oh, okay, it was in this cup that was used in the Kirtland Temple dedication or whatever. So that's one we're moving towards. I mean, in my head, there's plenty of smoking guns. There's so much circumstantial evidence that if we took all of this evidence to court, he would get charged with psychedelic use. Like, there's just so much evidence surrounding it. So as a, a gotcha, like, yeah, he was doing psychedelics. Not really yet, but that there hasn't been that much work done in the field yet. It's a relatively new field, so that remains to be seen.
Yeah, lots to brush away from
Right.
the past there and see what's under it.
Right.
All right. Any other questions, Eldon, or anything you want to put
I
in?
think this pretty well covers it. I mean, it's
I'm
an
sure
interesting...
we'll be doing another one soon.
Yeah. That perspective of Joseph Smith as an individual who had tendencies that were dark and light, let's say, just being a full three-dimensional person, that is not being talked about nearly enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I in terms of my recommendation, so I've read Cody Nakone's book called...
He's doing a revised version of it that'll be out soon, hopefully through an academic press, by the way.
Okay. It's called Mormonism, Magic and Drugs, Psychedelic.
Yeah, let's see. You got The Psychedelic History of Mormonism, Magic and Drugs.
Okay. And then you've got the paper, which appeared
2019, and The Entheogenic Origins of Mormonism, a Working Hypothesis. And then Cody and Bryce and I are working on a paper together, and like I'm slowly posting papers on my website and Substack on the topic. I'm working on a book on the topic, and we're going to be publishing a bunch through Harvard over the next couple of years on the topic. So it's moving forward pretty rapidly.
Yeah, and for me, I think those were helpful reading those two, the paper and the book. But I actually liked Robert Beckstead's solo work,
Sunstone.
The best, because I feel like it actually brought in more of like an integrative picture of mysticism and some spirituality, rather than the journal paper, which was more like, okay, this
academic
could have happened. Yeah. And they don't want to take a metaphysical position. But yeah, would you say, for most believing members, this sounds like anti-Mormon stuff? It sounds like it's...
even though it shouldn't, none of it is intended to be anti-Mormon in the least bit. Like, it's just, yeah.
I think that's an important aspect that you can't really grok, I think, as a believing Mormon, because you don't have any experience with any altered states of consciousness, because you don't even drink. Right. So this really is a blind spot, but it's not saying that the church isn't true because it was all something. It was all hallucinations. But this is actually...
Which it wasn't, because hallucinations is a problematic term. And just because something happened under psychedelics doesn't mean it wasn't veridical, doesn't mean it wasn't real. There's no difference in my mind from somebody who saw God sober versus somebody who saw God in psychedelics. Both experiences are equal in my mind.
Yeah, so there is, you can take this in different spiritual perspectives, and it sounds like you've got a range of perspectives in the Harvard Divinity School group. And so I think that's important, is that shouldn't be labeled as anti-Mormon or apologist, or it's more, let's explore this, and then you can come to your own conclusions of how that fits in. And it's interesting to see that this topic is, viewed very differently, even among believing Mormons, that these are herbs that are given to us by God, and Doctrine and Covenants 59 says that they should gladden your heart. And the only thing the Lord's offended by is that if you don't acknowledge his hand in these things, and then other people are like, no, this is the word of wisdom, this is drugs, which actually doesn't. So it's an interesting stuff ahead. So
Yeah.
thanks for coming on,
Thanks
Alex.
for having me on.
Thanks, Alex.
Um,
Yeah.
I guess where can people find you? Got a website, right?
Yeah, so my website's just my name, alexcriddle.com, and then I've got a link to a Substack there. It's just alexcriddle.substack.com. And then we'll hopefully have a page up for the Harvard working group soon, and then I'll post that on like my social media and stuff.
Cool. And you guys are
Yeah.
presenting at Sunstone.
We're presenting at Sunstone.
Yeah, I didn't realize Denver Snuffer was presenting. So it sounds like there's some fascinating topics. So psychedelics.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun weekend.
Mormon mysticism, quantum physics and spirituality, crystal grid meditation and stuff. So,
yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you.
Take care.